have a friend back here. I was wondering. Okay, you're good? Good, red? Oh, okay, great. Great. So welcome to Talking Back to the Radio. We're here from NPR, and we're going to spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about how we've been innovating on voice platforms for the past 2 to 3 years. Great. So I'm Ha-Hoa Hamano. I'm the Senior Product Manager on Emerging Platforms. Before this voice platform boom started, I was mostly working on connected TVs and connected cars, some wearables, and of course my claim to fame, the smart fridge. Over to my far right is Vince Farquharson. He is our Senior Interaction Designer on Emerging Platforms. So he and I have been working on the same team for, lucky us, both of us, we've been working on the same team for the past couple of years. And to my direct right is Katie Briggs. She is our product designer, mostly working on our internal tools for station publishing, but more recently working on our user research for our voice platforms. So we're hoping for the next 20 minutes to guide you through this journey with us, starting with a quick primer on public radio and on to why voice is important to NPR. And then go into some really practical and tangible ways that we've approached innovation on this platform, and then a sneak peek into the near future and far future of what we're thinking about. And so to start us off, here's Katie to intro NPR.
Hey, so quick show of hands. Who here is familiar with NPR? Oh, like almost everybody, yay, great, okay. So for like the 2 people that didn't raise their hands, NPR stands for National Public Radio. We're a nonprofit multimedia organization, and we're the leading provider of non-commercial news, entertainment, and information programming in the US. We were founded in 1970 to provide national news to local public radio stations, and we've since grown to become an essential news source with dozens of international bureaus, and our programming can be heard from coast to coast. So this is NPR's mission statement. We want to create a more informed public, and it's going to be a public that is kind of challenged and invigorated by having a deeper understanding of cultures, ideas, and events in the world around us. We do that in partnership with what we call member stations. Member stations are independently owned and locally owned and operated stations. There are 1,000 of them, more than 1,000 of them in our collective network. And there are over 1,000 of them in our collective network, and they air our programming and newscasts to nearly 30 million Americans every week, which is a lot to say out loud. And thanks to our member stations, 95% of the US population is in a listening range of a station that plays NPR programming. So that's our radio side, but there's a lot more at NPR than just what we air kind of over the airwaves. So who listens to NPR on their smartphone, maybe via one of our apps? Nice. And then who reads NPR News online? Cool, okay. Yeah, so as you can see, our content is available in a lot of different digital formats as well. Every month, nearly 39 million unique visitors come to npr.org. And in 2017, we had 955 million podcast downloads. When you combine our broadcast, podcast, and online audiences together, we reach more than 100 million users every month. So of course, as NPR was starting to innovate digitally, the other people in the news and audio ecosystems were expanding and exploring as well. And audio aggregators like TuneIn and on-demand services like Stitcher were serving content and programs that kind of exposed us to disruption. So we dug in deeper, and now we can compete with kind of some of the other big players on the on-demand stage. We also have an editorially responsible algorithm that serves up a stream of content that's curated especially for each user. And thanks to the work that folks are doing at our member stations across the country, we're able to provide a near-live multi-platform experience that brings together local, national, international, and breaking news. So clearly NPR is already in a lot of places, but Vince is going to talk about why we care about voice.
Thanks, Katie. Voice devices are gaining popularity in communal areas of the home. Let's see. This is the promise is that they can bring us together as they inform us. And that's a role that radio has traditionally played. So additionally, with the rise of voice UI devices, the hands-free nature of them kind of opens new possibilities for the user. So why does NPR really care about voice? In our most recent study with Edison Research, let's see, it revealed the habits and behaviors of smart speaker owners. So in this study, 70% of smart speaker owners said they listen to more audio at home since getting their device. Additionally, this is kind of opening up the possibilities for on-demand listening as well as what we call appointment listening with the radio. The same study revealed an appetite for local news, which is good news, since, as Katie mentioned, many of NPR's member stations have a robust news gathering and reporting apparatus. But how do we start to turn this information into action? To answer this question, I'm going to kick it back to Ha-Hoa.
All righty. So we're currently live with 3 skills on Alexa, wait for this, Jiffy, right. So our hourly newscast, which was the default newscast on launch with the platform. Play NPR, which is our live station streaming skill, and NPR One, which is our personalized, as Katie mentioned, our personalized and curated on-demand listening experience that mixes national and local news and podcast. And so how did we approach going live and going to market with some of these experiences? So our approach is a mix of lean UX, design thinking, and agile, and really, the principles are rooted in a collaborative and shared understanding. And so as devs, as designers, as product owners, and of course our stakeholders, we all are on the same page on what our KPIs are, the problems we're trying to solve, and really the approach, that we are committed to this process, that we are going to pay equal attention to the think parts as we will to the make parts, as we will to the checks, where we're validating our assumptions at all of these steps in a shared and collaborative way. And so when we don't, when we're cutting corners, either in the think phase or the make phase, that also is brought out in a shared way, and so that it's, if we cut user testing, we're going to go into market with unchecked assumptions, right? And so all of this is brought out into the open and agreed upon before moving forward. And the other hack to the approach is that we really are trying to tighten the loop between the sections. When we kind of silo and say, oh, well, design's taking care of the check phase, and our interaction designer is taking care of the think phase, let's skip ahead to the make phase. It's really distracting, and it really breaks up that shared understanding and collaborative understanding, because now you have things you're thinking about and things you're making at the same time, and it's really distracting and really not staying true to the approach. And so that's something that we're really trying to tighten up every time we're going to market or iterating on our experiences. And so what does this look like in day to day? And so we love our sticky notes. And so we do workshopping for all of those phases. And so even at this goal setting phase, when we're talking about numbers, right, and like these KPIs and metrics, everybody in the room understands what that metric is and what we're trying to hit with those goals. And so it isn't just me as a business owner, as the product owner, that's championing that number. The entire team is championing a number. And that's the same with gathering assumptions. I have different assumptions than Katie and Vince does, what things we're going to solve for the users and what the user thinks. And then similarly, like with the hypothesis, how are we going to solve that for the users? We all have different opinions on how that's done. And so we put it all out on the table and are super transparent about that process. And from there, we do the affinity mapping. Obviously, there are going to be themes. Sometimes we do agree, and the devs agree. And so we collate those into themes and areas that sound like they're the same thing in how we're approaching the problem. And then you go on to prioritization, again, going back to the KPIs that we all decided on. These are the 3 things that are really going to solve that problem for us. These are the 3 things that we can actually do per our developers' input, like these are actually the things that we can do in a meaningful time frame. Which goes into the prioritization and rapid prototyping, which Vince and Katie are going to talk about, that we need to kind of go and move from those sticky notes directly to our users internally and our stakeholders internally and our users externally to really check those assumptions. So it needs to happen in this rapid cycle. And so this is what it actually looks like when we were doing the NPR Play NPR stream. And so we spent about 2 development cycles, which at NPR is 2 weeks, in the think phase. Again, doing this workshopping, setting aside time to get in the room and do those sticky note exercises, and getting the KPIs done. And then we moved on to the make phase. And so this is where Vince was prototyping, or our other designers were prototyping, our developers were getting into the weeds of the tech design at the same time. We're, as a product owner, really honing in on the MVP feature set. And we were shopping that around internally to make sure and really get back to what we were building. And then the check phase, we actually spent quite a bit of time on, which is good. I appreciate that part. And we were taking it out to the users. And really, these are some of the feedback that we were getting from that validation. Before we went to market, they said, gave us real feedback on some of the interaction paths, and obviously some of the tech challenges that we were having, and we made those changes before we went live. And so this was the streaming skill. We had a very specific problem that we were solving, but Vince is going to talk about go in the Wayback Machine and talk about before we even got to kind of this very particular use case, and go through our approach on how we were going to just go to market at all on the voice platforms. And so, take it away.
Thank you, Ha-Hoa. In the beginning, we didn't know what we didn't know. So we needed to understand how a user who has an affinity for NPR might use a smart speaker or voice UI device to ask for the things that they love. And what would that response be from the system in order to make, how would a useful response look like or sound like? Here are a few examples of the types of scenarios that a user with an affinity for NPR might want to do with a voice UI system. So let's see. When we set up a round of user testing, and we did some recruiting, and fairly importantly, we want to recruit for and screen participants with frequent NPR use and the type of user who is likely to become the type of user that has a real affinity and a real connection for NPR. We gathered some background and news on their news consumption habits, and we tried to understand their familiarity with NPR, and we kind of asked around their daily habits. We also created we didn't create it. We used a hypothetical device because we wanted to understand how they might use these VUI devices without the constraints and without the UE baggage of a platform, right? This was just a fancy Bluetooth speaker that we gave a name, and there was no trickery. We basically told users that this is not a real smart speaker and that the moderator or someone would be controlling it, and we started asking them questions. We also created a kind of a fake living room in our office, and this was using the technology and the money that was available to us at the time. We created a kind of a fake living room so that we can start to try and take users into that moment. The objective was to get them in that moment without the expectations of a particular brand of device or a particular type of space. So you can see here that we have, in this experiment, which is different from the one that I kind of showed you before, we actually have an echo, but for the lexicon experiment, we actually did create, we dropped our little Bluetooth speaker there instead. So let's see. So there's the moderator seat. Let's see a laptop running the prototype. There's a smart speaker and a participant seat. And what did we learn? So the headline is we did get our lexicon. We understood how people might ask for these features and run through these scenarios on kind of a fairly agnostic basis. We did also discover that we needed to create brandable voice commands, something that feels like what you would ask an NPR host for. And we also realized that when the system responded, we wanted it to respond in a way that kind of an NPR host might do that. So kind of keeping on brand with that. We also understood that we would likely need to teach users about the higher level features, search for a podcast, or just play something based on my preferences. Additionally, we had a hidden finding with that. We found that users needed a little bit of help in order to find search on that. So these are the kinds of tests that will pay hidden dividends as you run them. So let's see, what's next? Oops, sorry. Next, I'm going to kick it over to Katie to talk about a second experiment.
Okay, thanks. So earlier this year, we had the chance to kind of experiment and test 3 different smart speaker prototypes, one of which was for multimodal devices, and the other 2 were for kind of the traditional smart speaker. These are the questions, kind of one question per experiment that we wanted to answer. And so we know that there are a lot of interesting and kind of weird challenges when it comes to thinking about prototyping and testing for voice specifically, but the basic requirements for setting up an experiment remain the same. So we know with typical testing that when it comes to building and testing a prototype that you want your tool to be flexible, and there are a lot of different ways to prototype your new ideas and test new ideas. But a big part of the experiments that we did relied on the audio that we produced at NPR instead of interacting with a voice assistant directly. And so the prototyping tools that are being built for voice didn't quite meet our needs. And so we had to get creative because the space is just still so new and the tools are so new, we kind of had to find a different way for our tests. So this is a screen capture of the process that we use to actually create some interactive experimental soundboards. Like I said, there are a lot of new and exciting tools for sound, for our voice prototyping, but we actually took a super low-tech approach and turned to PowerPoint, of all things, to create this kind of like slide full of buttons, each of which has been matched to an audio clip. So when you click a button, it plays a sound. And it's super ugly. It's probably the ugliest thing as a designer that I've made in my whole career. But it works, and it's a really good reminder that when it comes to prototyping, it's okay if it's ugly, especially if a user's not going to see it, as long as it's something that works, right? So this is the setup for our testing room for most of these 3 experiments. This Echo played our prototype via Bluetooth. This laptop in the back was kind of our recording and broadcasting center. It recorded the sessions and also broadcasted out to our remote observers and a remote note taker. Maybe. There we go. This video camera just was hooked up to that laptop. And also, the camera is actually just a document scanner, but it's a lot less intrusive than a traditional camera might be, so we like it for user testing. And then this laptop displayed the script and ran the prototype, and the moderator sat in that seat, and this tiny mic picked up our audio. Come on. Okay. So as Ha-Hoa talked about earlier, you always want to have kind of a list of assumptions to test, and assumptions are statements that explain what you think is true. But the reality of voice assistants is still just kind of starting to take shape, and so we're learning more and more all the time about how people are using these devices, and there are kind of new or undiscovered contexts that make coming up with assumptions more difficult. So when I think about brainstorming assumptions, I like to think about what we care about and what we don't care about. It's really hard to kind of set your priorities when the ground is kind of shifting underneath you. So we kind of got rid of the what don't we care about portion. We just focused on what we care about, we can define that, and then really just listen for other insights that users could give us. And that was especially true when it came to the experiments we did with multimodal devices. We just kind of were less restrictive about what we were listening for, and we actually got a wealth of new insights from people, not only on how they reacted to our concepts, but also how smart speakers with screens are going to kind of change the future of voice UI. And then across the board of testing, right, you always want to test with real users. And so we did the legwork and recruited 30 participants to come in, like actual smart speaker owners, to come into NPR headquarters and take part in this test. And the good news is they were great, real users. But the bad news is that testing for voice is a little different than testing for, a mobile app or a website or something that's more traditionally tested, just because it's such a distracted experience. It's always kind of the voice assistant component or the voice device is secondary to what your user is typically focusing on, like doing the dishes or getting ready for work. So we thought about that a lot when we were setting up our test room, as well as kind of defining the tone for the test. So this is taken from the user's perspective. We have puzzles and games and scratch paper and other things people can fidget with, so they don't feel like they have to stare at the smart speaker while they're interacting with it, because that would never happen in their homes. And so we really wanted to make sure, like from the beginning, that users knew that they could interact with anything on this table, or even feel free to take out their phones and mess around, just because that's more like what they would be doing with these devices in their own homes. So from a user testing perspective, we had quite a few takeaways. We had a bunch of valuable takeaways for the research as well. But we learned a lot about testing in this process. So first, prototyping is definitely a time for function over form, especially if your users aren't going to see any visual side of your prototype. Like my PowerPoint soundboard was really clunky, but it worked. And it really is, okay, it's totally okay that it's ugly as long as it totally works. Second, the world of voice is still super open and new, and so you really want to keep your restraints around your research to a minimum. Define those assumptions that you want to test on, and then just really stay open and leave some breathing room for any other assumptions that you'd find along the way. And finally, we need to find ways to make tests feel less awkward for participants. So as we continue to experiment with voice platforms, and especially as we're doing tests in person, we need to find ways to make our users more comfortable. Is that providing jigsaw puzzles and scratch paper? Is that leaving the room so that they can interact with the speaker kind of more comfortably? Is it assigning a task, like wash these 5 dishes while you're interacting with this skill, kind of like what they would be doing at home? That's still something that we need to find out.
Yeah, and I would additionally add that if you know you're going to be, and your product is going to end up on different flavors of smart speaker, you might want to just test with a hypothetical device that is unbranded in order to get users to kind of shrug off that baggage of an Alexa versus a Google Home versus a HomePod or whatnot, and just create something that looks like nothing they've ever seen, so that their expectations don't follow them.
Thanks. So looking ahead, I'm going to go over this real quick because I want to open up the floor for questions. So we have, as Katie mentioned and Vince mentioned, we have a lot of open questions out of these tests. And so really, these are a couple of them. There are a lot of them every day. Where does NPR naturally fit in your day? We used to have this kind of mindset right in the early days of that, well, people will move from the newscast, and then if something's live, they'll move to live streaming, and then later in the day, they'll move to play NPR One. But really, we've seen that users know us from these various entry points separately or solely, and so we're really trying to figure out, that it's not this really neat linear, funnel or path that we really are trying to fit it in naturally into their day. The relationship between them, the device, and the voice assistant, is it a voice assistant that happens to have a screen, a voice device that happens to have a screen? Is it a screen that happens to have a voice assistant? So what are you expecting out of your assistant and your device and our content? Those are a lot of people involved in that interaction. And then lastly, who can we connect with in this voice everywhere future? As we've seen yesterday and today, we know that there's a generation of folks that are interacting with our content straight from voice and technology and devices. Like the voice is the expected way to interact with technology. How do we put what's their expectation for how they get to our content? And obviously for folks on the that aren't as naturally or kind of ingrained into using this technology, but love our content, and this device is in their home, and they don't know that both of the things that they're doing with the weather and the to-do list, they can also do with to interact with our content. And so those are our open questions that we have. Love to hear your open questions on both kind of our approach and kind of our experiences that are out there.
I can run back over there with the mic.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you think about the financial aspects of following on
Great
this?
question.
And the other part is, whoever did the images, thank you very much. You made my day.
Great. Oh, the credit is on there. She did our annual report, our illustrator for our annual report. So if you look up the 2017 NPR annual report, they're all there. And yes, she was wonderful. Thank you. But to address your question on monetization, we do have our infrastructure to monetize our podcast, and so we can stitch on both sponsorship as well as internal promotions. And so we can, in certain cases, we want to be very cognizant of that, where you are in your moment and when you're asking for it. And so our infrastructure is there, and it just depends on the audience and how we want to monetize that part.
Just a follow-up question.
Sure.
I don't want to take the time here, but you are a non-for-profit organization, and you do underwriting and all these kind of things. And there is a wave of internet radio as well going on. Do you see some sort of integration between voice and internet?
There's two things in that which I want to address. One definitely is our the business model and our relationship with our stations. What's super important for us is that the users connect to their local station. And for those that listen on broadcast, there are pledge drives and ways that you can donate and to keep the programming going. And so that is like one of our number one goals, is that that your local station is WGBO and WBGO, and that you are donating to that station to keep the programming going. And so that's one of the goals there. And then in terms of kind of internet radio, as Katie mentioned, our apps, we have listening happening a lot of different places. Desktop, you can see kind of our desktop audience as well. And we really are thinking about kind of that seamless handoff between your car, your phone, the web, and obviously the voice devices as well. And so that's the part of the future for us as well.
We had a couple of other questions here. I'll make my way
NPR
around.
One super user over here.
Have you all found an efficient way to do remote testing with the Echo
good question.
devices or Google?
Short answer, no. Especially for the things that we're doing that are more experimental. A lot of the platforms that we looked at for user testing require you to have some kind of live skill, and we just didn't have anything that was like out in the wild and ready for people to test. Ideally, like that's the goal, right? So we can talk to everyone from around the country instead of just folks in DC, but we haven't found anything that's like quite right for our needs yet.
Yeah, I would add that we haven't seen anything that even comes close to getting a seamless kind of remote testing experience with that device. And I think we can all work our way through that. And I think the audiences, as we're kind of working our way to ideally what we want, they're a lot more forgiving than you think they are. Especially if you take the curtains down and let them kind of see what you're doing behind the scenes. I think there's a lot of trust there. One more question in back here? Yeah. Oh, no, not necessary.
I just want to shout out to KRA, member. Woo! And I wanted to ask, because I did not, you made me realize I did not know this. I wake up in the morning and go, Alexa, play KERA. Is that one of your skills? Is that their skills? Is that a streaming service?
Great question. Yeah, that is currently coming from TuneIn. And so we are trying to help with that for other stations who aren't being represented there. And so the play station name utterance is currently coming through TuneIn.
Hang on, got one more question.
We have one right there. Right behind.
Oh, sorry. Oh.
Great.
Right. Yeah, he had the same question on the remote testing. All right, one
Yeah,
more.
as far as requiring remote testing really quickly, I think it just needs to be something that is obviously reliable and also like creating the realist experience in that person's home. Like if we're going to the effort of trying to have this experience kind of more organically for them, we want it to feel as real as possible.
Yeah.
That's kind of the biggie for me.
I just want to ask, is data privacy something you guys would look into?
Yeah, I mean, both on the platform, obviously where the platform is and being on that platform, knowing kind of where they are, where their stance is on that. I think going into the experiences there, again, just knowing it comes into the decision of participating on the platform altogether and staying on top of it. I don't know if that answers your question. Like, if we're not comfortable with the way the platform is handling it, then we wouldn't go on the platform. question up front? No. All right, well, we'll stick, oh, go ahead, yes, go.
So you talked about the natural bent into
Mhm, mhm.
So if you think about cognitive load and how much people have to kind of keep in mind,
Yeah.
how do you make it obvious for folks what they can do on a daily basis? Let's say they don't turn the app every day. And for you guys, it's always on your mind.
I can restate the question in case if someone didn't hear that. It was, what do we do about cognitive load, and how do we kind of teach users what is possible with a product that we're developing? I can start that off a little bit and say that's one of the things we found in our first experiments is that there are people who they know what they know, and they don't. It's hard for them to get a grasp of what is possible. One of the two things that we found effective, at least on the Alexa platform, is using the cards to teach people. But one of the hidden findings that we found is that in a household, the person that uses the device is not always the person who set up the device or who maintains it. So they might never, ever see a card. And we found cases where they didn't even know that a card existed for them to learn about. So what we found was, and our radio and audio app, it makes this easy, is using the skill itself as a training opportunity to kind of introduce possibilities to the user.
Okay, looks like folks are coming in for the next panel, so we'll come, yeah, we'll come, yeah.
I'm really sorry. We're going to have to handle this offline. We are over time, and I think we're
Yeah, getting booted.
we're
Thank
very
you.
likely to get booted. Thank you.